What if women woke up tomorrow and couldn't hide their sexual urges anymore? It happened subtly at first. A glance that lingered too long, a laugh that seemed too forward, eyes that didn't dart away when caught in the act of looking. There was no apocalypse, no virus, no sudden flash in the sky, no gods descended and no bombs fell, just a quiet shift in the weight of human behavior, as if something ancient inside had shrugged off its shackles. For centuries, women were told to be modest, quiet, controlled, told to fold their desires inward like laundry, to dress a certain way, to laugh not too loud, to never ask for too much, especially not when it came to pleasure. They were taught to monitor themselves with the precision of prison guards. Be pretty but not too available, be confident but never forward, seductive but not in a way that made anyone uncomfortable, want but never too openly, and if you did, deny it. Always deny. But what happens when nature refuses to listen? It wasn't all women, not at once, just a few, then more, and then all at once it spread like the blooming of some invisible flower. The rules didn't work anymore. The inner voice that said do fell silent. In its place came a certainty, not chaotic but deeply calm. The kind of calm you only feel when something undeniable finally rises to the surface. And then came the whispers, the panic, the curiosity. At first the world watched. Men uncertain, women radiant not just in beauty but in boldness. Some chased fantasies they'd held since adolescence. Others just stopped lying to themselves, to their lovers, to the mirror. A woman in Ohio asked her coworker out at lunch, leaned across the table, and said precisely what she wanted to do to him. She wasn't joking. In Brazil, a grandmother posted a video confessing she hadn't felt this alive since her 20s. In Seoul, a conservative professor walked off a live interview after a student asked if shame was ever anything more than a leash. She smiled as he left. It became clear the old framework was collapsing, because desire isn't gendered but control is, and that control had always leaned heavily in one direction. Patriarchy had built its fences not around women's bodies but around their impulses, their fantasies, their capacity for unfiltered, unapologetic hunger, and now that hunger had breached the walls. The media spun itself into confusion. Talk shows oscillated between celebration and fear. Was it liberation or disorder? Some said it was empowerment. Others whispered the word addiction. Churches called it a spiritual crisis. Therapists called it progress. Social media caught fire, overflowing with stories, some funny, some chaotic, some profoundly moving. One woman described how she finally kissed her best friend, another woman, after years of pretending she didn't want to. Another admitted to leaving her husband, not for someone younger, but for someone who listened, who saw her, who responded when she whispered what she actually wanted. Relationships were tested. Monogamy itself began to tremble, because when a woman stopped pretending, she didn't always stay. When she stopped performing, the mask fell off, and beneath it, she didn't want what she'd been taught to want. Many did, but many didn't. And in that realization, the old structures, marriage, courtship, fidelity, began to rearrange. Of course, there was backlash. There always is. When the controlled become uncontrollable, the controllers panic. Conservative lawmakers tried to frame it as mental illness. A rise in inappropriate behavior, they said, a fabricated hormone imbalance, a spiritual decay. Pharmaceutical companies rushed to develop medications as if female desire was an infection to cure, as if a woman wanting too much or too often was something unnatural. But it never had been. Desire in its pure form doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't apologize. It doesn't always wait patiently in the wings of a polite society. It breaks things, it remakes things, and that's what was happening. The world built on male fantasy was suddenly flooded by female truth. Not always soft, not always pretty, but honest. Women weren't just sexual. They were selecting, choosing, initiating, exploring, some gently, some ravenously, some with tears in their eyes, all of them unashamed. Porn sales dropped, because what's the use of fantasy when reality becomes more interesting, more mutual, more electric? Men who had spent their lives in quiet frustration, secretly wishing women would be more forward, now found themselves intimidated. Some adapted, some blossomed, others panicked. The myth of the sexually passive woman was dying, and with it, the male ego, or at least the version that relied on domination. Schools had to rewrite their sex education curriculums. For the first time, textbooks addressed female arousal with the same seriousness as male. Girls weren't taught just to protect themselves, they were taught to understand themselves, to own their urges, not fear them. to question why society ever made them ashamed. One 12-year-old in France asked her teacher, "Why do boys get to brag about it but we're told to hide it?" There was no good answer. Dating apps changed too. Instead of waiting for messages, women began to make the first move, and not shyly. Profiles became bolder, clearer, unapologetic. Ghosting dropped. Clarity increased. Honesty became sexy. And slowly the whole dynamic flipped. No more breadcrumbing, no more games. When a woman wanted you, she let you know. And when she didn't waste your time. But not all consequences were smooth. Marriages built on control crumbled. Affairs were revealed not as betrayals but as symptoms. The truth emerged like steam from a boiling pot, unstoppable, scalding, cleansing. Some families broke apart, others grew stronger. Because when honesty finally enters the room, pretense has to leave. And with pretense gone, only connection remains, or nothing at all. Religions split in response. Some doubled down on purity. Others embraced the change, reframing desire as divine rather than sinful. New spiritual movements arose, led by women who no longer saw pleasure as something to fear, but something to revere. Temples of sensation. Sanctuaries of touch. Gatherings where the body was not separate from the soul. Of course, not everyone understood. Some still clung to the old scripts. They mocked. They condemned. They tried to suppress again. But you can't unsee freedom once you've glimpsed it. You can't put the wildfire back in the matchbox. And then something beautiful happened. Men, real men, began to listen. Not just out of fear, but out of curiosity, out of desire to meet this new energy, not control it. They learned to receive, not just to give, to surrender as much as to pursue, to unlearn centuries of dominance and discover the electric joy of mutual hunger. It was awkward at first, vulnerable, but it led to deeper connection and, in many cases, better sex. Not just in act, but in meaning. Because when both people really want, something magical happens. The act becomes sacred again, not a transaction, a transformation. And slowly the world adapted. Clothing lines shifted. Less about hiding, more about expression. Advertisements began showing women not as objects, but as initiators. Art changed. Films were no longer built around the male gaze, but became playgrounds for the feminine lens, rich with nuance, hunger, subtlety, and unapologetic intensity. Language evolved too. Slut lost its sting. Words like aggressive were replaced with assertive. The tone of judgment softened into one of curiosity. What does it mean for a woman to want, to reach, to claim? And in the center of it all stood the question no one had dared ask aloud before. What if this was never about sex? What if it was about honesty? Because when women stopped hiding their desire, it wasn't just about lust. It was about truth, about power, about reclaiming the parts of themselves they had been taught to disown. It was about no longer apologizing for being fully human, about no longer shrinking to fit a fantasy, about walking into a room and not asking, "Am I too much?" but instead, "Am I finally enough for myself?" And so we return to the beginning. What if women woke up tomorrow and couldn't hide their sexual urges anymore? Maybe the real question is, what would the world look like if women never had to hide them in the first place? Maybe we'd have different stories, different myths. Maybe Eve wouldn't be blamed for the apple. Maybe desire wouldn't be the root of sin, but the seed of creation. Maybe young girls would grow up unashamed. Maybe young boys would grow up knowing that intimacy isn't something you take, but something you share. Maybe love would change. Maybe everything would. But then again, maybe it's already happening. Quietly, in coffee shops, on buses, in bedrooms, in the space between a whisper and a moan, in the eyes of a woman who no longer lowers her gaze, in the lips of one who asks for exactly what she wants. Because once the balance breaks, it cannot be reset.